has expired.
The order.
Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, may I begin by congratulating you on the way you have served this House as Speaker since assuming the role at the beginning of last year. As someone who's known you probably longer than anyone else in this chamber, sir, I've been very impressed with how you've settled into what is a challenging, difficult and very important role within this Parliament. And I think that members who obviously spent the first few months of your tenure testing you out in the way that all new speakers are tested would recognise your integrity, your commitment and your dedication to this chamber and to the traditions and the privileges of this House. And can I also say in that context, sir, that I want to acknowledge your two assistants who are retiring, Eric Roy and Ross Robertson, long servants of this House both, characters in their own right, and people who will be remembered as fair and decent New Zealanders who have made a very solid contribution to the conduct of affairs in this country and to the electorates which they have represented. And to all of the other members who are retiring and whose valedictories we've been privileged to hear, thank you for your service to your communities and to your constituents. What these speeches show, in a way that perhaps only a maiden speech shows, is a little of the vision and the personality behind the individual, and a little bit of the aspirations that they bring to the role, and a little bit of the integrity and the reflection that they have on the role as they come to a conclusion. Mr Speaker, we can be well satisfied with the calibre of parliamentarians in this country. It's sorry to see those people move on, but this is a bit like school at the end of term. Most people come back, some move on, there are mixed feelings, and life by and large carries on unchallenged. Mr Speaker, I think that is the same for a Parliament at the end of its term. This is the 50th New Zealand Parliament coming to a conclusion. It's the end of 162 years of consecutive parliamentary government. The election of the 51st Parliament in a few weeks will put us into that rare league of a very few number of countries that have had continuous democratic parliamentary government for that length of time. And I think as all the debate takes place on the hustings, all the cat-calling, the name-calling, the abuse and the substance of debate flows around, we should remember that we are one of a very select band of countries to have retained the thread of democracy for that length of time, and that's a very important privilege for all of us. And Mr Speaker, I have been very pleased during the term of this Parliament to see all of the provisions of the United Future National Confidence and Supply Agreement honoured, and I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister in that respect and say that it has been a pleasure working with him and his team throughout the term, as it has been with my colleagues, the Honourable Tariana Turia and the Honourable Peter Sharples and Te Uaroa Flavel from the Maori Party. We don't actually have a bilateral agreement with the Maori Party, but we do work closely with them on a number of issues, and I have been struck by the level of accord that we have on those in terms of a particular view and where we have been able to work very constructively and positively together. Mr Speaker, I won't go through all of the provisions of our confidence and supply agreement that have been implemented, but I do want to highlight two which I think are critically important. The first, and by far the most significant, was the announcement just a couple of days ago that Wellington's almost mythical, certainly long-awaited Transmission Gully Highway has finally been agreed to proceed as per our agreement as a public-private partnership, and that work will begin next year. I saw a piece in the paper the other day that made a reference to Mr Field, who had been the Member of Parliament for Otaki, who back in 1919 had suggested that Transmission Gully ought to be developed as a World War I memorial highway for the burgeoning motor vehicle fleet in New Zealand. My records show that the first such reference to Transmission Gully being developed as some sort of a highway, though in those days it was seen as a railway, was in 1906. But it was another 20 years after Mr Field's claims in 1919 that serious consideration began to be given to Transmission Gully, a mere 75 years ago in 1939. We are patient people in this city, but I think waiting 75 years to get a highway development agreed tests even the most patient of dispositions, and Wellingtonians will be absolutely delighted to see work commence on this highway very shortly and to see its completion by 2020 so that we do have that second access and egress from our city. We do have a modern flow which will speed up the traffic movement between here and the Kapiti Coast in particular by around 10 to 15 minutes, and will make it much easier for commerce and trade coming into the city using our port and our airport. And I am very pleased, after a personal campaign of well over 20 years, which has seen me introduce at least 2 members' bills to this Parliament, bring petitions to this Parliament, work with successive governments to see that agreement in place and that highway being now on the point of construction commencing. The second thing that I want to comment on was the passage late last year of the Game Animal Council Bill. This has had quite a similar period of gestation, although not quite 75 years, but it's been a hope by those in the recreational hunting sector for many, many years that some form of national representative statutory body could be established to give account of and recognition to their interests, to ensure that their role in contributing to the management of the game estate in New Zealand was recognised and was able to be taken account of. And the establishment of that council by legislation late last year and by appointment earlier this year, and the fact that it's now meeting and up and running, is a very important achievement in that regard. It sends a couple of important signals. The first signal is that the large number of New Zealanders who enjoy outdoor recreation in this country are recognised, do have a place and a voice. And the second signal that it sends is that a small party committed to some pretty key ideals and working in collaboration with a major party of government can achieve things that might not normally be on the scale of activity of that government party, simply because it's got so many other things to worry about. So that voting for small parties, giving particular focus to certain key areas of policy, is a worthwhile outcome because they can be achieved. And that gives a level of confidence moving into elections such as the one that is forthcoming about the worth of voting for those organisations. Mr. Speaker, the House is being dissolved shortly to contest the general election. There will be the challenges implicit in that about policy and direction of the country. We stand at a very critical phase. We've come through the biggest, most massive economic depression since the 1930s. We've come through relatively unscathed in comparison to a number of other countries. The challenge now is not to fritter away the strength that we've established, but to use the gains of that constructively and positively to lay foundations for the future that will see sustained economic growth, that will see a boost in incomes, that will see confidence levels return so that population is retained here and that new migrants feel confident coming to this place and welcome within it. And one of the nasty undercurrents, I believe, that is already seeping into this election campaign is the issue of race. We've seen this card played many ways, many times over the years, where a particular segment of the population is isolated and therefore by implicit insinuation blamed as the cause of a range of other issues. Migrants coming to Auckland create a housing crisis. You can read the code. And that is a very nasty development in our society, not just for the political implications of the game, but because, more importantly, it starts to divide our population. It starts to set people against each other. And at a time when this country needs to be moving ahead positively in a broad, multi-ethnic, multicultural way, to start to play these narrow, sinister games for political advantage, Mr. Speaker, is, I think, despicable. So the only solution that I would proffer for people who feel concerned about that is the very simple one of making sure they do not vote for those parties preaching that sort of anathema as policy. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, can I wish every member who is seeking re-election good fortune, good luck, a good positive campaign. Can I say to those who are leaving us that I have valued your service and your company, and I know that your contribution to the country is not yet at an end. And to all members of Parliament, as the 50th Parliament comes to a conclusion, can I congratulate you for the contribution that you've all made in some way or another to the progress of this country over the last 3 years.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr.